The gunfight at the OK Corral. It was the ultimate frontier. A place where the pursuit of fortune was only eclipsed by the proximity of death. This was Tombstone, Arizona Territory, 1881. A boomtown built on silver, greed, and a deep-seated, simmering hatred. For months, this town had been a pressure cooker, divided between two powerful and irreconcilable factions. On one side, the lawmen, the Earp brothers, Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan, and their volatile legendary friend, Doc Holliday. They represented the town's business interests, the rule of law, and the Northern Republican establishment. Opposite them stood the self-proclaimed Cowboys, a dangerous, loosely organized gang of rustlers, smugglers, and thieves. At their core were the Clanton-McLaury brothers. They were the rural faction, defiant of town authority, and determined to carve out their own lawless domain in Cochise County. This was not merely a criminal conflict. It was a socio-political civil war. The tinderbox was lit by a simple but profound piece of local legislation, Tombstone City Ordinance No. 9, which strictly forbade carrying weapons within city limits. As the town marshal, Virgil Earp chose that day to enforce it. The Cowboys saw it as an act of war. The conflict ignited in the bitter hours before the sun was fully up. Clanton, drunk, armed, and loud, spent the night roaming Tombstone, publicly threatening to kill the Earps and Doc Holliday. Wyatt Earp found him, and the confrontation was brutal. Wyatt, in an act of cold, calculated power, pistol-whipped Clanton into submission, then hauled him off to the court. Ike was disarmed, fined, and released. But he was far from chastened. He was humiliated. He was lethal. In the early afternoon, the rest of the cowboy leadership rode into town. Frank and Tom McLaury, and Ike's younger brother, Billy Clanton. They were heavily armed, and they were looking for trouble. They defied the ordinance openly, gathering in a small, dusty lot on Fremont Street. Virgil Earp learned of the gathering. Sheriff Johnny Bean, a political rival and cowboy sympathizer, claimed he had tried to disarm them, but failed. Virgil knew the situation could not stand. The lawmen strapped on their guns. This was no longer about a town ordinance. This was about who ruled Tombstone. The four figures of the law stepped out onto Fremont Street. Their destination was the narrow lot adjacent to C.S. Fly's photography studio, just down the street from the rear entrance of the famous OK Corral. Virgil Earp, his authority on the line, led the charge. Wyatt walked beside him, his gaze fixed. Doc Holliday, his hand resting near his coat, tuberculosis racking his lungs, seemed utterly indifferent to the impending apocalypse. They stopped. Less than 6 feet separated the two groups. A shocking, intimate distance for a battle to the death. Virgil Earp delivered his final command, the words echoing with the full force of the law. "You men have violated the law, and you will have to disarm." Frank McLaury swore, defying him. The law demanded compliance. The code of the Cowboys demanded blood. The shot that began the most famous gunfight in American history is still debated by historians. But once the first pistol fired, all hell broke loose. 30 seconds, perhaps 30 shots. A chaotic, close-quarters bloodbath that ripped through the silence of the afternoon. Ike Clanton, the man who had screamed for vengeance all morning, was suddenly reduced to a terrified coward. He rushed Wyatt, shouting that he was unarmed, and bolted, escaping through the doorway of the photography studio. But his friends fought on. Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury drew their weapons. Tom McLaury, possibly unarmed, staggered into the street only to be fatally shot by a blast from Doc Holliday's shotgun. The smoke and noise were deafening. Virgil Earp was hit in the leg. Morgan Earp was shot through the shoulder. Doc Holliday was grazed. The battle ended as quickly as it began. The lawmen stood, wounded but alive. On the ground lay 3 cowboys, Billy Clanton, Frank McLaury, and Tom McLaury. They were dead. The smoke cleared, but the battle lines hardened. Ike Clanton immediately filed murder charges. For a grueling month, the Spicer hearings were held. Testimonies were delivered, often conflicting, with newspaper reports heavily biased toward one faction or the other. The key question was agonizingly simple. Did the Earps act as legitimate officers of the law, or did they commit cold-blooded murder? The final ruling came. The judge determined the Earps and Holliday acted lawfully, using necessary force to enforce an ordinance. They were acquitted, but the law would not have the final say. The Cowboys, now sworn to vengeance, began their campaign of terror. In December, Virgil Earp was ambushed and permanently maimed. Then, in March 1882, the ultimate act of revenge. Morgan Earp was assassinated, shot in the back, while playing billiards. This was the final breaking point. Wyatt Earp, his face hardened by grief and rage, traded his badge for a personal mission. He accepted a commission as Deputy U.S. Marshal and began his infamous Vendetta Ride. He would hunt down and kill every man he held responsible for his brother's murder. The law had failed him, so he became the judge, jury, and executioner. The gunfight at the Corral lasted less than 1 minute. Yet, it became the foundation of the American Western myth. For decades, the true, complex historical events, the political feuds, the property disputes, the legal technicalities, were simplified. The event was romanticized, sanitized, and ultimately renamed by Hollywood. It was not a clean fight between white hats and black hats. It was a messy, chaotic, bloody culmination of a socio-political feud. But in that blinding 30 seconds of gunfire on a dusty street in Tombstone, Arizona, a legend was forged that still defines the American frontier.